In 1984, Ethiopia was a country the world had written off. A devastating famine had killed nearly 1 million people. Skeletal children filled every international newspaper. The images were so horrifying, they inspired one of the biggest charity concerts in human history, Live Aid. But within a decade of that famine, Ethiopia would begin one of the most remarkable economic transformations Africa had ever seen. Double-digit GDP growth, tens of millions lifted from poverty, roads, railways and dams built across a once broken land. And behind all of it, one man. His name was Meles Zenawi. And depending on who you ask, he was either a brilliant visionary who rescued a failing state, or a ruthless authoritarian who crushed everything in his path. Today, we unlock the truth. To understand Meles Zenawi, you have to understand the Ethiopia he was born into. May 8, 1955, the small town of Adwa in the northern Tigray region. This was no ordinary birthplace. Adwa was the site of Ethiopia's most famous military victory, where Emperor Menelik II defeated an invading Italian army in 1896. The only African nation to defeat a European colonial power on the battlefield. Meles grew up under the long reign of Emperor Haile Selassie, a man worshipped as a god by Rastafarians abroad, but viewed very differently by millions of hungry, landless peasants at home. When Meles was just 19, Selassie's empire collapsed. A brutal Marxist military junta called the Derg seized power, led by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. The Derg didn't just replace the emperor, they unleashed what became known as the Red Terror, a campaign of mass arrests, torture, and public executions targeting anyone they considered an enemy. Thousands of students, intellectuals, and activists were killed in the streets. For a young, brilliant university student like Meles, studying medicine in Addis Ababa, the choice became clear. He could stay quiet and survive, or he could fight. He chose to fight. In 1975, Meles abandoned his medical studies and disappeared into the rugged mountains of Tigray to join the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. For the next 17 years, he lived as a guerrilla. 17 years of hiding in caves, of fighting a military regime backed first by the United States, then by the Soviet Union, of watching comrades die, of surviving military offensives, bombings, and the 1984 famine that devastated his own people. But what made Meles different from other fighters wasn't just his courage, it was his mind. While others fought with guns, Meles studied strategy, military, political, and economic. He read voraciously. He debated ideology for hours. Other commanders respected him, not because he was the most aggressive fighter, but because he was always 3 moves ahead. By the late 1980s, he had become the undisputed leader of the TPLF and began forming a coalition with other rebel groups across Ethiopia under an umbrella movement called the EPRDF. Then, in May 1991, it happened. Mengistu fled the country. The Derg collapsed. After 17 years of armed struggle, the guerrilla from Tigray marched into Addis Ababa as the new ruler of Ethiopia. He was 36 years old. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because what Meles built over the next 2 decades genuinely shocked the world. When he came to power in 1991, Ethiopia was one of the poorest countries on earth. GDP per capita was barely above $130 a year. Infrastructure barely existed. The country depended almost entirely on foreign aid. Meles had a different vision. He called it the Ethiopian Development State. a model inspired partly by East Asian economies like South Korea and China. The government would lead economic development. It would direct foreign investment. It would build infrastructure aggressively, even borrowing heavily to do it. And the results were stunning. By the mid-2000s, Ethiopia was recording GDP growth rates of 10 to 11%, year after year. For almost a decade, it was one of the fastest-growing economies in the entire world. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, Africa's largest hydroelectric dam, began under his direction. Addis Ababa got sub-Saharan Africa's first light rail system. Thousands of kilometers of roads were built connecting rural communities that had been isolated for generations. Child mortality dropped by more than half. The percentage of Ethiopians living in extreme poverty fell from over 60% to under 30%. Even his harshest critics acknowledged this. Under Meles Zenawi, Ethiopia was transformed. He also became one of Africa's most respected voices on the global stage, representing the continent at G8 summits, negotiating on climate change, pushing for African ownership of the continent's development agenda. The man who grew up in a guerrilla camp was now sitting across the table from Barack Obama and Angela Merkel. But here's the uncomfortable truth that his admirers often ignore. Before we get into the darkest chapter of his rule and the events that still divide Ethiopians today, if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe. We unlock history like this every week. Now, back to 2005. May 2005. Ethiopia held its most competitive election in history. For the first time, a genuine opposition coalition, called the Coalition for Unity and Democracy, mounted a real challenge to Meles and the EPRDF. International observers poured in. The campaign was passionate. Ordinary Ethiopians believed, perhaps for the first time, that their vote might actually change something. Early results suggested the opposition had made dramatic gains, potentially even winning the capital, Addis Ababa. Then the government froze the results. Meles claimed victory. The opposition cried fraud. Mass protests erupted across the country. The government's response was brutal. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators. When the smoke cleared, an independent inquiry, commissioned by the Ethiopian government itself, confirmed that at least 193 civilians had been killed. Hundreds more were wounded. Tens of thousands were arrested. The entire leadership of the opposition was imprisoned. Journalists were jailed. Human rights activists disappeared into detention. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout Meles's rule, press freedom rankings placed Ethiopia among the most repressive regimes in the world. Journalists were regularly imprisoned under anti-terrorism laws that critics said were written specifically to silence dissent. The 2009 anti-terrorism proclamation was so broad that even peaceful protest could be prosecuted as terrorism. The EPRDF, under Meles, won the 2010 elections with 99.6% of parliamentary seats. Not 70%, not 80%, 99.6%. Even some of his strongest defenders struggled to explain that number. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented systematic torture in Ethiopia's prisons. Ethnic minorities reported discrimination. The Oromo and Somali regions experienced military crackdowns that displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The man who had fought a dictatorship for 17 years had, in the eyes of many, built one of his own. In June 2012, Meles Zenawi appeared at the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. He looked thin, tired, but still sharp, still commanding. Then he vanished. For months, the Ethiopian government said nothing. State media ran old footage. Officials deflected questions. Rumors spread. Was he ill? Had he been overthrown? Was he already dead? On August 20th, 2012, the Ethiopian government finally announced what many had already suspected. Meles Zenawi was dead. He was 57 years old. The official cause was described vaguely as an unspecified infection. Conspiracy theories immediately filled the silence the government had created. To this day, the exact nature of his illness has never been fully and transparently disclosed. The mourning was extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians lined the streets of Addis Ababa. Whatever you thought of the man, the grief was real. For many Ethiopians, especially the poor, especially those who had lived through the famine and the Red Terror, Meles Zenawi represented survival, progress, pride. African leaders flew in from across the continent. World leaders sent condolences. And then the debate began, a debate that has never stopped. So, where does history place Meles Zenawi? The honest answer is, it depends entirely on which Ethiopian you ask. If you ask the farmer in the Amhara highlands, whose child no longer dies of preventable disease because of the clinics Meles built, he was a savior. If you ask the journalist who spent 3 years in prison for reporting the truth, he was a tyrant. If you ask the economist studying Africa's development, he was a model, proof that a poor African country could grow itself out of poverty through disciplined, state-led development. If you ask the opposition politician who watched colleagues killed in the streets in 2005, he was a man who chose power over people. Here's what is undeniably true. Meles Zenawi inherited a country broken by decades of dictatorship, famine, and civil war. He built something from the ruins, something real, something visible. Roads, hospitals, dams, a growing middle class. And it is equally undeniably true that he maintained power through fear, violence, and the systematic silencing of dissent. He built institutions that served his vision, but not institutions that could survive or challenge him. The question isn't really dictator or great leader, because history shows us that these two things are not always opposites. The question is, what do we do with complexity? What do we do with a man who saved millions of lives and also ordered the killing of protesters? Who built Africa's fastest-growing economy and also ran one of its most repressive states? Meles Zenawi died at 57. In some ways, history died with him too, because we will never know what kind of leader he might have become, or what he might have chosen if he had lived longer. What he left behind is a country still wrestling with his legacy, an Ethiopia that is faster, richer, and more connected than he found it, and an Ethiopia still searching for the freedom he promised but never fully delivered. That's the story of Meles Zenawi, one of the most complex, consequential, and debated leaders in modern African history. What do you think? Was he a dictator, a visionary, or something in between? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. If you want more deep dives into the history that shaped our world, subscribe to Past Unlocked History and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, the past is never really past. It's just waiting to be unlocked.